It's hard to think of a more appropriate location for this event, in surrounds which one could say offer a mini-history of Scots life just as potent as Abbotsford. Even before getting into this capacious room, we pass across the splendid high-arched Parliament Hall, home of the original Scottish Parliament prior to its being handed over to the lawyers after the Union of 1707. It was there that senior advocates perambulated together in small groups to avoid being overheard, shadowed by junior members of the faculty, such as the young Scot, eager to give the impression that they too had work to do. Some of you might have noticed the statue of a sedentary Scot, one of my favourite images of him, the sculpture by John Greenshields, who started his own career as an apprentice stonemason. Seek Sedabat, it says at the foot. Thus, in this way, he sat. Then, through the now laptop-filled reading room of the Advocates' Library, where Scott in his early years got vital access to manuscripts and rare books, and of which, of course, later provided the foundation of the National Library of Scotland. One year, I seem to remember the faculty placing in this room, for this occasion, the leather chair which Scott occupied as a clerk of the Court of Session. Perhaps it's still here somewhere, and Scott is sitting in it, in spirit at least. Seek, or thus. There are two things to introduce today, and I'll try to be brief from now on. The first concerns the award of the club's annual prize, consisting of an inscribed medal and cheque. This started off way back in the club's history as an essay prize, but for the last 3 years has been awarded to the final year undergraduate in the English department, achieving the best marks in Scottish literature. And this year's winner is Ruth Saltire. We'll see more of her in a second. During her undergraduate degree in Scottish literature, Ruth took courses in Scottish works ranging from medieval and Renaissance writing to contemporary Scottish fiction. She specifically worked on Scott when studying romantic novels, writing on his relationship with national identity. Ruth's dissertation focused on representations of Scottish colliers and their relationship with folk tradition. The Scott Club Medal was awarded in particular for her first-class mark in a course on fairy tales, which is a strong Scottish focus. Her interest in folk culture led her to found the Scottish University's Folk Festival in her final honours year, an event she is currently working to take into its second year. It has also prompted her recently to start studying an MSc in Celtic and Scottish Studies at the University of Edinburgh, where she hopes her background in Scottish literature will be a valuable asset. So all that remains is to award the prize of a cheque, a medal, and a volume of addresses to the Scott Club. Finally, it's a great pleasure to introduce Nigel Leask as today's speaker. Nigel was previously reader in romantic literature at Cambridge University, where, among other things, he gained a reputation for his groundbreaking work on Orientalism. He is now Regius Chair in English Language and Literature at the University of Glasgow. In fact, I believe he's the third in a succession of speakers to the Scott Club from that university, indicating the high concentration of academics specialising in Scottish literature there, as well as their willingness to be called upon. His most recent critical study is Robert Burns and Pastoral, Poetry and Improvements in Later 18th-century Scotland, Oxford University Press 2010, which won the Saltire Prize for the best research monograph in 2010. His edition of Robert Burns's Commonplace books, Tour, Journals and Miscellaneous Prose, the first volume of the AHRC, that is the Arts and Humanities Research Council funded Oxford edition of Robert Burns' writing was published in 2014. He is co-investigator of the AHRC-funded Curious Travellers, Thomas Pennant and the Welsh and Scottish Tour, 1750 to 1820, which is going to take place or be carried out between 2014 and 18. And he's currently completing a book entitled Stepping Westward, Writing the Highland Tour, 1750 to 1820. He's a Fellow of the British Academy and of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and a Vice President of the Association for Scottish Literary Studies. His lecture today, titled Scots Antiquary and the Ossian Controversy, seems timely on two counts. Firstly, in view of this year being the bicentenary of Scott's novel of that name, and also, secondly, in light of the renewed interest in the field of literary antiquarianism. It will examine, so he tells me in a sneak preview, Scott's presentation of the Ossian debate in the Antiquary as one aspect of the contentious discussion about Scottish identity and ethnicity, relating it to Scott's 1805 Edinburgh Review essay on Ossian and suggesting that it plays a more significant role in the novel than has hitherto been recognised. So, without any more ado, or preempting on my part, over to the real thing, Professor Nigel Leask.
Thank you, Peter, for that generous introduction, and thank you to all of you for inviting me to speak tonight. It's a great pleasure to be in this beautiful library. I've actually never been in here before, which is an embarrassing admission probably, but it was always the first time, so it's a great pleasure. What a beautiful building. It's also a privilege to be invited to speak on the 200th anniversary of Scott's great novel, The Antiquary. And I hope I'm not going to try and draw attention away from Scott's achievement by talking about Macpherson's Ossian too much, although I will be doing that a bit. So, can you all hear me okay? Is it coming across loud and clear? I'll just get my timepiece sorted out. Although The Antiquary was a personal favourite of Sir Walter Scott's, he worried that it was more concerned, quote, to describe manners minutely than to arrange an artificial and combined narration, and regretted that he'd been unable to unite these two requisitions of a good novel. Critics have largely endorsed this view, especially when compared to the achievement of Waverley and Guy Mannering, the two novels which had just previously been published. These two novels, as Penny Fielding, who I see in the audience there, Penny Fielding describes The Antiquary as, quote, an unhistorical historical novel. I like that, an unhistorical historical novel. While Ian Duncan notes that, for a work composed merely months after Waterloo, it's striking that it unfolds its epiphany of national solidarity through the mock-heroic narration of a conflict that does not take place. And of course, Duncan is referring there to the French invasion scare, which turns out to be a false alarm that occurs near the end of the novel. Reflecting on Scott's sense of imbalance, David Punter suggests that The Antiquary is more concerned with the making of history than with history itself. He describes the rather creaky Gothic plot as a peg on which to hang a series of characters and a set of views on the central issues raised by the cultural phenomenon of The Antiquary, which seems to me absolutely right. What exactly is at stake here? This is a much later portrait of Alan's portrait of Scott, just before he died, actually, so sometime after the writing of The Antiquary. I really can't. I thought it would be bigger, but I hope you get the idea. What exactly is at stake here? The late Susan Manning argued that antiquarianism was the other of Enlightenment historiography, the double agent on its boundaries, obsessed by the flotsam and jetsam of the past, yet lacking the connectivity that made for grand historical narrative. Scott's own comments on The Antiquary seem to acknowledge that, for all the satire levelled at Jonathan Oldbuck and his ilk. And in the passage I just read out at the beginning, he seems to acknowledge that the fact that he'd succumbed to a kind of antiquarianism in preferring manners, the description of manners, to narrative. obviously get caught up in the particular. In 1836, his son-in-law Lockhart noted that, despite laying false trails for identifying Oldbuck's real-life prototype, Scott could hardly have scrupled about recognising a quaint caricature of the founder of the Abbotsford Museum in the inimitable portraiture of the Laird of Monkbarns. And focusing on one of these antiquarian debates in particular, namely the controversy about James Macpherson's publication in the early 1760s of his translations of the poems of the 3rd century Gaelic bard Ossian, I might seem to be making a mountain out of a molehill, given that in plot terms, sustained discussion of Ossian is limited to a single chapter in the novel. That's the first chapter of the 3rd volume. There it serves the limited purpose of dramatising the relationship between Oldbuck and his hot-headed Highland nephew, Captain Hector MacIntyre. The Antiquary's more extensive concern with Roman and medieval antiquities better reflects Oldbuck's own scholarly taste. And we even learn that the unworldly Lord Glenallan has never even heard of Ossian. Neither does the Gaelic world of Ossian seem particularly relevant to the novel's lowland setting in Fairport, and scholars have speculated and editors have speculated that Fairport is somewhere like Montrose or Arbroath, situated on the northeast coast of Scotland. Certainly, anyway, geographically distinct from the Highlands of Waverley or of Rob Roy, or indeed of Scott's Highland verse romances. This is Romney's portrait of James Macpherson. Nevertheless, in Scott's time, Macpherson's Ossian poems and the controversy that they aroused played an important role in the debate about Scottish history, literature, and identity. This was true even in the years after the Highland Society of Edinburgh had published its largely damning report on Ossian in 1805. This was the subject of a long review by Walter Scott in the Edinburgh Review, of course, and published anonymously, as was the custom in the period. That's to say, a whole decade before the composition of the Antiquary. Scott admitted that he had, quote, devoured rather than perused Ossian as a boy. And in the 1830 preface to his poems, he acknowledged that Macpherson had first persuaded him that, I quote, writings on Highland subjects were qualified to interest the reader. Strange, then, that absolutely no reference is made to Ossian, or indeed to James Macpherson, in either The Lady of the Lake, 1810, or The Lord of the Isles, 1815. Both verse romances set in the Highlands, and both accompanied by voluminous antiquarian notes. So why the sudden appearance of Ossian in the Antiquary in 1816? In this lecture, I'll explore the relationship of Ossian with some of the novel's other antiquarian preoccupations, concluding with the suggestion that Macpherson's poem may even have inspired elements of the much maligned plot of the Antiquary. At stake here, it was more than just a question of authenticity, namely Macpherson's claim that fragments of ancient poetry, or his epics, Fingal and Temora, all these works were published in the early 1760s, were translations of ancient Gaelic poetry. Just as contentious was his boldly revisionist account of Scottish history, presented in the poem's introductory dissertations, footnotes, and appendices. What we tend to forget today is that Ossian wasn't just about the verse, it was about what we call the paratext, about the surrounding the introduction, the notes, the dissertations that accompanied it. And in a sense, these used the verse as a kind of, as a scaffold to propose a very contentious account of Scottish history and identity. Here, Macpherson sought to promote, in Colin Kidd's words, the continuity of Scottish liberty and national identity from hazy Caledonian roots. Rejecting, and this is on the slide, rejecting Lord George Buchanan's Dalriadan account of early Scottish history, the notion that the Scots had settled, come from Ireland and settled in Dalriada in the west of Scotland, Argyll in the west, and had moved eastwards and northwards from that point. Macpherson proposed that the modern Highlanders are the genuine descendants of the ancient Caledonians, and not a pretended colony of Scots from Ireland who settled first in the north in the 3rd or 4th century. Macpherson gravely offended Irish opinion by representing the Irish as colonisers from Scotland, so he reversed the Buchanan story and argued the island had been empty before it was settled by the Scots. And in his epic Fingal, he depicted the Irish and their leader Cuchulainn as vulnerable and enfeebled, dependent upon the Scottish Fingal, King of Morven, to rescue them from invading Norsemen. It's now widely accepted that Ossian presented its readers with an ideologically as well as aesthetically doctored version of genuine Gaelic tradition. In other words, I'm certainly not happy with that. You still come across claims that Ossian was a fake, and I don't believe it was a fake. And I think that's been substantially proven by the scholarship of people like Gaelic scholars like Derek Thompson. But it was heavily confected and concocted. He really tarted up the sources, the original Gaelic sources. But certainly Derek Thompson was able to show with great detail the presence of at least 16 Gaelic ballads in the text of Macpherson's own English translations. The extent to which Fingal, who's the hero of Macpherson's epic, is the offspring of Galgacus, who was the heroic leader of the Caledonians at the Battle of Mons Graupius in AD 43 in Tacitus's Agricola, has never been adequately grasped by commentators. Fingal asserted Scotland's flagging national pride during the crisis of the Bute administration in the early 1760s, when it was still smarting from the debacle of Culloden and the renewed threat of foreign invasion. In the first half of the 18th century, travelling antiquaries like Alexander Gordon, and Sandy Gordon, as he's referred to in the novel, is the author of the 1726 Itinerarium Septentrionali, the weighty tome which Oldbuck is clutching in the Queensferry diligence in the opening scenes of Scott's novel. So Sandy Gordon obsessively tracked the Scottish sites of Roman camps and battles in search of the material traces of Roman conquest. And he was followed by a number of other antiquaries. So Oldbuck's got real-life antecedents. But I think after 1760, the publication of Ossian reinvented the Highland landscape in a rather different light. It showed it as the scene of Fingalian resistance rather than Roman triumph, quite possibly because the military threat of Jacobitism had been defeated and once rebellious Gaels drafted into Britain's war against France. The famous boulder burial in Perthshire's Small Glen, Glenalmond, for example, was initially identified as a Roman tomb by Hanoverian soldiers constructing General Wade's road networks in the 1730s. But sometime after 1760, the stone was renamed Clach Ossian, or Ossian's grave, and it became an obligatory site on the 18th century petty tour of the Highlands, famously inspiring William Wordsworth's 1805 poem Glenalmain. In this still place, remote from men, sleeps Ossian in the narrow glen. The central character of Scott's Antiquary isn't, of course, the mysterious but insipid southern hero, Mr. Lovell, but the eponymous antiquary, Jonathan Oldbuck, Laird of Monkbarns, whose good-humoured foibles and learned wit permeate the novel. Oldbuck's antiquarian obsessions are shared by his neighbour and sparring partner, Sir Arthur Warder. But it's not Warder so much as the blue-coat beggar, Edie Ochiltree, who shares central stage with Oldbuck. And both characters prove to be crucial agents in unfolding Scott's rather creaky plot. And I was going to give you a little bit of an account of the Sanctum Sanctorum with a few quotations from Ian Gordon Brown's wonderful book, The Hobby-Horsical Antiquary, but I was apologising to Ian a minute ago that I had to cut it because I was over length. Anyway, this would have been cue for... Shame on me, but this is you get a picture instead. Of the Sanctorum. The relationship between Edie and Oldbuck is dramatised in the famous episode early in the novel when Oldbuck is showing off his property of the Came of Kilprudens to Lovell, which he claims to be the site of Agricola's camp before the Battle of Mons Graupius, where, as we've heard, the Romans had defeated the Caledonians in AD 84. Oldbuck's claim is founded upon his discovery of a Roman altar stone bearing the inscription ADLL, which he interprets as an acronym for Agricola Dicavit Libens Lubens, i.e. Agricola willingly and happily dedicated this. But Oldbuck's antiquarian dreams of the Roman praetorium, or camp, are shattered by Edie's brutal interjection. You can see he's putting his head up there behind the antiquarian Lovell to deflate his antiquarian fantasy by suddenly piping up, "I mind the Beginnoit, I mind the Beginnoit." And he goes on to recall just how just 20 years before, he and some friends had built the shelter for a friend's bridal ceremony. His friend was called Aiken Drum, and he interpreted the inscription ADLL as Aiken Drum's Lang Ladle. Yet, while Scott explodes antiquarian illusions here, he hardly promotes the cause of scepticism. Caroline McCracken Flesher, who is, I think, stood in this spot in recent years, rightly points out that Edie tells a lie that should have been obvious to Scott's readers, and probably was actually. Far from being an old pal of Edie's, Aiken Drum is the protagonist of a well-known and entirely fantastic children's song. He played upon a ladle, and his name was Aiken Drum. I remember when my daughters watched The Singing Kettle, it was a real favourite, so it's still current. Edie's correct version of historical memory turns out to be based on a scrap of playground verse. Ian Duncan writes that frauds and hoaxes proliferate through the novel's texture of illusion as well as its plot. Oldbuck's praetorium is probably fraudulent, just like Edie's claim that exposes it. So is the historicity of Oldbuck's planned epic, the Caledoniad. I'll come back in a minute to compare that to Ossian, which is another quote-unquote fraudulent epic, or indeed the genealogy of the early kings of Scotland. Hoaxes punctuate the plot as well. Duster Swivel's salted mine of non-existent treasure. Remember, he's a German con man. The malicious claim that Lord Glenallan's marriage is incestuous, or that the hero Lovell-Neville is a bastard. A thin line divides the fraudulent from factual history for Scott, that great writer of historical fiction, who, we might recall, failed to deliver his own planned history of Scotland about the same time as he was composing the Antiquary. In this connection, McCracken Flesher reminds us of David Hume's caveats about how meaning is made. There is no history without data, and the meaning that is identity, personal, communal, national, is made in the gaps and from the clashes arising from the circulation of equivalent, fragmentary stuff. If the Lovell-Neville plot centres on contested genealogy, the question of Scotland's, and by extension Britain's, national genealogy looms large in the antiquarian clashes between Oldbuck the Whig and his Tory and formerly Jacobite neighbour, Sir Arthur Wardour. Oldbuck is descended from a line of Protestant German printers who had been exiled at the start of the Reformation for printing the Augsburg Confession. And like his father, he strongly identifies with the Hanoverian dynasty and the Protestant succession. In 1745, Oldbuck's father, as Provost of Fairport, had arrested the young Sir Arthur and his Jacobite father and had them committed to the Tower of London for the duration of the uprising. But, as we learn in chapter 5, historical enmity has mellowed into antiquarian sparring between the two neighbours. So Oldbuck believes in the Gothic theory of Scottish origins. He's firmly convinced that the early Scots came from Scandinavia, and that Scandinavia was the officina gentium, the mother of modern Europe, the nursery of those heroes, stern to resolve and stubborn to endure, who smiled in death. Wardour disagrees, preferring a story of Irish and Celtic antecedents. The debate about Scottish origins is introduced in Volume 1, Chapter 6, in the form of an after-dinner disagreement about the authenticity of the Fergusian regal lists. I'll spare you the details, but that's basically the Stuart royal genealogy based on the medieval and early modern histories of John of Fordun and Hector Boyce, which dated the Scottish kings back to Fergus MacFurcard in 330 BC and had been subjected to a lot of sceptical scholarship in the early 18th century, mainly by Father Thomas Innes. This leads to a dispute, as these things do, about the ethnicity of the Picts. After a tasty dinner of undercooked Solent goose, or northern gannet, at Monkbarns, the two antiquaries press the respective claims of Celt and Goth, witnessed by the bemused Lovell, the ladies having wisely retired. Each party invokes a battery of antiquarian authorities. Oldbuck summons the authority of Sir Robert Sibbald, Alexander Gordon, and the learned John Pinkerton in support of the Gothic theory, while Wardour evokes Father Thomas Innes, George Chalmers, and Joseph Ritson in favour of the Celts. But the sole surviving word of the Pictish language, Penval, P-E-N-V-A-L, can be interpreted either ways. As Penny Fielding notes, language breaks down as the key to ethnic origins, ancient history, and property rights. Now, this is to have a look at Pinkerton. I'm going to have a quote now. As Colin Kidd has shown, the real life debate was racially toxic. In his dissertation on the origin and progress of the Scythians or Goths of 1787, John Pinkerton, just like Macpherson, was notorious for forgery. He forged at least 25 medieval Scottish ballads and later fessed up to it. But Pinkerton, anyway, was a Gothicist of the true stamp, who was Celtophobic. He claimed that the Celts were a weak and brutish people, savages since the world began. Their personal manners are nasty and filthy, as they were in ancient times when they washed their bodies and cleaned their teeth with urine. In slightly milder vein, Oldbuck dismisses the Pictish kings as sprung from the tribe of MacFungus, mushroom monarchs, every one of them, sprung up from the fumes of conceit, folly, and falsehood, fermenting in the brains of some mad Highland shenanigans. In contrast, by 1830, Scott had made up his own mind, contra Oldbuck, that both Scots and Picts were quote, by descent, a Celtic race. But it's a social rather than racial pedigree that turns the debate sour in this particular exchange, as Sir Arthur sneers at Oldbuck as descendant of a Westphalian printer. Oldbuck retaliates by reminding Wardour of the blot on his family escutcheon. Wardour of Knockwinnock storms out of the house with his daughter Isabella, and both nearly lose their lives to high tides on Halket Head, but for the timely appearance of the hero Lovell and Edie Ochiltree, who rescue them both from a watery death. Now, the subject of Ossian is first raised in a breakfast conversation after Lovell's disturbed night in the haunted Green Chamber, when Oldbuck offers to show you the controversy upon Ossian's poems between MacCribb and me. I hold with the acute Orcadian, he with the defenders of the authenticity. The controversy began in smooth, oily, ladylike terms, but is now waxing more sour and eager as we get on. It already partakes somewhat of old Scaliger's style. It's a wonderful account of the Ossian debate, Ossian controversy. Scott absolutely hits the nail on the head there. As his name suggests, in addition to his Gaelic patronymic, MacCribb is something of an antiquarian magpie. We elsewhere learn that he's walked off with Oldbuck's cherished Syrian medal in his pocket. It comes up again later when Oldbuck is lamenting the destruction of his lacrimatory from Clochnaben by Hector's dog Juno. Quote, the main pillar of my theory, in despite of the ignorant obstinacy of MacCribb, that the Romans had passed the defiles of these mountains. Although MacCribb is a fictional composite of the Gaelic partisans for Ossian, people like the Reverend MacNichol, MacQueen, MacLagan, Oldbuck's acute Orcadian is a real character, the Scottish historian Malcolm Lang. I'm sorry that's such a bad picture of Malcolm Lang, but it was the best I could find. I'm sure he looked better than that. Actually, Scott paid a visit to him in Orkney when he visited in 1814, and describes him then. He was quite ill and a bit of an invalid. So this is the acute Orcadian. Influenced by Pinkerton, Lang had attacked the authenticity of Macpherson's Ossian in his History of Scotland, 1800, and again with a rather excessive display of critical energy in an edition of Macpherson's poems published in 1805, which tracked every single one of Macpherson's supposedly ancient allusions and metaphors to a modern literary source, thereby, of course, proving to his satisfaction that the poems were forged. Notably, Lang also published Macpherson's juvenile poetic efforts, The Hunter and The Highlander, alongside the Ossianic corpus, to expose some telling similarities between the plots of his own verse and the supposedly traditional epic Fingal. Lang noted that in both, a mysterious Scottish hero of indeterminate paternity rescues Gaeldom from foreign invasion, a point to which I'll return at the end. Walter Scott wrote in 1805 to the Lichfield poet Anna Seward, the Swan of Lichfield as she was known, a wonderful expression, As for the great Ossian dispute, I would be no Scottish man if I had not very attentively considered it at some point in my studies. That same year, in July 1805, he published a lengthy review of the Highland Society's report on Ossian and of Malcolm Lang's edition in the Edinburgh Review. Scott's review opens with a facetious worry that, quote, by mingling in the approaching storm, we run the risk of a chance blow from a Highland claymore or an Orcadian battle axe. So the ranks are drawn out here, the Goths versus the Celts. He demolished one of Macpherson's partisans for explaining away Lang's critique on the grounds that it was inspired by resentment at, quote, the severe checks given by the ancient Caledonians to his predatory Scandinavian predecessors, which had raised prejudices not yet extinct in the Orcadian historian. He was still smarting about the way the Vikings had treated the Scots in earlier centuries. Scott protested that the same individual, the Reverend Andrew Galley, claimed to have heard oral recitations in Gaelic of the Ossian poems that corresponded verbatim to Macpherson's translations, when the latter was still a child. As Scott put it in the letter to Seward, when once the Highlanders had adopted the poems of Ossian as an article of national faith, you would far sooner have got them to disavow the scripture than to abandon a line of the contested tales. The question of ethnic prejudice lies at the roots of the antiquarian dispute that Scott explored a decade later in the Antiquary, illustrating the need to get beyond what we might anachronistically call an old firm mentality in theorising Scottish identity. The oft-quoted conclusion to Scott's review, let us therefore hear no more of Macpherson, would seem to foreclose the whole issue, but given that a staggering 27 new editions of the English Ossian were published in the years between 1801 and 1830, this seems to have been very far from the case. In fact, Scott's review is more ambivalent than his summary verdict allows, in acknowledging that Macpherson was the first Scottish poet to have reached an international audience, and that he had in fact drawn on genuine Gaelic sources. Macpherson's fault wasn't so much in embellishing traditional material. Scott must have been conscious that he'd done something rather similar in mending and polishing traditional ballads in his minstrelsy of the Scottish border. As late as 1830, he praised Macpherson as, I quote, an excellent poet rather than a faithful editor and translator, and he confessed that the English Ossian was a model for his own first original poem, Glenfinlas. Rather, the problem lay with what Eric Gidel has marvellously described as Ossianic unconformity. Ossianic unconformity. That's to say, Macpherson had mixed up the sequential stages of history, superimposing modern manners, chivalry and romance, upon Iron Age Celts, whose savagery Scott compared to that of modern-day Tahitians or American Indians. To that extent, he insisted, Macpherson's English Ossian poems bore no more resemblance to authentic Gaelic Finnegacht ballads than John Holmes' Tragedy of Douglas does to the ballad of Gil Morris. He hoped that the Highland Society would publish an authoritative collection of ancient Gaelic poetry and translation, together with the original text in an appendix, on the model of Charlotte Brooke's Relics of Irish Poetry, published in 1789. And because Macpherson had failed to do any such thing, or to produce any material evidence of his Gaelic sources, Scott found him guilty as charged. During his 1814 cruise around the Highlands and Islands on the Faroes, Scott conducted his own Ossianic fieldwork. Following Thomas Pennant and other authorities, he recorded Ossianic place names in Skye, above the Coolin range, and he reported that, quote, a taxman of MacLeod's called Grant recited the celebrated address to the sun, and another person repeated the description of Cuchullin's car, but all agreed to the gross infidelity of Macpherson as a translator and editor. Both these capacities, by the way, do occur in Macpherson's Fingal, and as the modern Gaelic scholar Derek Thompson has shown, they are indeed quite close translations of original ballad material. Significantly, when Scott visited the most celebrated of all Fingalian landmarks on the Isle of Staffa, which you can see in the famous picture published in Pennant's 1772 tour in Scotland, and it was purportedly discovered by Joseph Banks in 1772, Scott referred only to the celebrated cave. He didn't call it Fingal's Cave, he just called it the celebrated cave. Scott's major fictional engagement with Ossian occurs at the start of Volume 3 of Antiquary, in a comic dialogue between Oldbuck and Hector McIntyre. After Hector's dog Juno has smashed the lacrimatory from Clochmaben, as I've already mentioned, Hector quickly placates his uncle by offering him a beautiful Egyptian cameo ring bearing Cleopatra's head, which he had procured, quote, from a French savant to whom I rendered some service after the Alexandria affair. Now, that must be a reference to the Battle of Alexandria, in which Hector's regiment, the Black Watch, had played a very distinguished role. Unfortunately, for the chronology of the novel, the battle took place on the 21st of March, 1801, and most authorities agree that the novel is set around about 1794. And there are one or two other slight issues with chronology, but that does seem to be an issue. There's no way that the Black Watch would have been in Egypt in 1794. Strolling down to Steenie Michelbachet's funeral, Hector mentions to his uncle how the soldiers of the Fortitois celebrate their father's fame in order to raise their martial spirit. I used often of an evening to get old Rory MacAlpin to sing us songs of Ossian about the battles of Fingal and Lamon Mor and Magnus and the spirit of Muirartach. And did you believe, asked the aroused antiquary, did you absolutely believe that stuff of Macpherson's to be really ancient, you simple boy? Believe it, sir? How could I but believe it when I've heard the songs sung from my infancy? But not the same as Macpherson's English, Ossian. You're not absurd enough to say that, I hope, said the antiquary, his brow darkening with wrath. But Hector stoutly abode the storm. Like many a sturdy Celt, he imagined the honour of his country and native language connected with the authenticity of these popular poems, and would have fought knee-deep or forfeited life and land rather than have given up a line off them. Well, Scott was retracing well-trodden territory here, going over some of the themes he discussed in his Edinburgh Review essay in 11 years earlier. But his dialogic reworking of the arguments in this passage is actually quite balanced in exposing the prejudices aired by both parties, both by Oldbuck and by Hector. When Hector insists that it's reasonable that he should admire the antiquities of my own country more than those of the Harolds, Harfagers, and Hackos you're so fond of, i.e. the Scandinavian heroes, Oldbuck rebuffs him angrily in a very Pinkertonian vein. Why, those mighty and unconquered Goths were your ancestors. The bare-breeched Celts whom they subdued were but their mancipia and serfs. Unsurprisingly, Hector bridles at this, insisting that such names are very improperly applied to Scotch Highlanders, proclaiming the antiquity of his Celtic pedigree as a MacIntyre. But Oldbuck's folkloristic curiosity, and I think his better nature as well, because although he's influenced by Pinkerton, he's no Pinkertonian in terms of his character. There's a kind of benevolence to Oldbuck. So I think his genuine interest in folklore is illustrated in a number of passages throughout the novel, especially listening to the ballads being sung in the Mucklebachet cottage, for example. So that gets the better of his Pinkertonian prejudices. And he asks Hector if you can recall any of the Ossianic poems recited by the regimental piper, Roderick MacAlpin. Hector obliges while remonstrating that his uncle does not understand the Gaelic. This forces him to translate one fragment of verse from its original. This is on the slide. A dialogue between the poet Ossian, or Ossian, and Patrick, the tutelary saint of Ireland, which he runs over, well garnished with achs, ochs, and ochs, and similar gutturals. The exchange between the pagan Ossian and the Christian saint turns out to be just as bad-tempered as that which has just ensued between Oldbuck and Hector. Upon my word, son of Fingal, says Patrick, while I am warbling the psalms, the clamour of your old woman's tales disturbs my devotional exercises. Ossian answers, dare you compare your psalms, you son of a blank, glossed by Hector as a female dog, followed by, do you compare your psalms to the tales of the bare-armed Fenians? The Fenians were referring there as the Fianna, to the warrior band around Finn MacCool or Fingal. Oldbuck is quick to observe, is quick to compare the racy Gallic originals with Macpherson's anodyne translations. You don't get that kind of language, that kind of bawdiness in Macpherson's version of Ossian. Hector's obliged to concede that, if you are sure of that, Macpherson must have taken some very unwarrantable liberties with his original. The exchange concludes with Oldbuck's surmise that the epithet bare-armed Fenians is a mistranslation of bare-arsed Fenians, which I think is an allusion to David Hume's remark about the bare-arsed banditti in his comments on Ossian. And he says, I should have thought the nudity might have been quoted as existing in a different part of the body, i.e. not the arm. At this point, in a wonderful mock heroic passage, Hector is sidetracked by the sight of a seal upon the beach, which arouses his sporting instincts. Snatching his uncle's walking stick, he sallies to the attack, only to be worsted in the conflict by the aggrieved phoca. He picks himself up off the rocks, quote, just in time to receive the ironic congratulations of his uncle upon a single combat worthy to be commemorated by Ossian himself. As well as parodying Hector's identification with the Ossianic mighty hunters, this incident comically foreshadows the more serious single combat fought between Hector MacIntyre and Lovell at MacIntyre's instigation for the favours of Isabella Warder, the heroine, in which the Highlander again comes off worse. Remember, he's wounded in the duel. As David Hewitt indicates in his notes to the Edinburgh edition of the Antiquary, the poem recited here by Hector isn't actually contained in Macpherson's Ossian corpus, but it's actually quoted from a dialogue between St Patrick and Ossian, which is a translation by the English ballad collector Thomas Hill of Ossian agus an Cleric, published in the Gentleman's Magazine in 1783, and said to be taken down from the recitation of a Highland blacksmith in Glenorchy, probably a man called Alexander MacNab, who we can actually track down. Thomas Hill, who published the Gaelic originals of the verses alongside his translations, was happy to acknowledge that many of the Finnegacht ballads which he collected on his field trips did have an Irish source. And of course that was a fact, as I mentioned, that Macpherson hotly denied, that Macpherson tried very hard to claim that the Ossian corpus, the poems, had nothing to do with Ireland at all. And the Irish versions of them, which were well known, were later versions of Scots or Caledonian originals. And it's really interesting that one thing that Macpherson does throughout Ossian is to airbrush out the figure of St Patrick from the poems. So there is a kind of, one of Macpherson's poems is based on this original fragment or ballad, but St Patrick is reworked as a Chaldean kind of hermit. And I think it's also part of the general attempt to sever the Ossian stories from Catholic popular culture that Macpherson is very dedicated to that project. And that's partly why it finds great favour. Some of the great defenders of Ossian's authenticity are the Presbyterian ministers, the MacLagans and McNichols and others whom I've already mentioned, who were busy trying to purge popish superstition from their parishes in these very decades. Although never mentioned by Scott in his 1805 review, it seems highly likely that Hill's articles in the Gentleman's Magazine had an important influence on his perceptions of the Ossian controversy. As I've said, Hill's Ossian poems, in contrast to Macpherson's, were in a sense the real thing, revealing all the directness of expression, including a kind of comic vulgarity, the bare-arsed Fenians, revealing all the directness of expression and comic vulgarity of a primitive poetry passed down through oral tradition. Revealingly described by Scott himself in his 1830 essay on popular poetry as a degrading species of alchemy by which the ore of antiquity is deteriorated and adulterated. Above all, Thomas Hill's versions of the Gaelic ballads don't threaten the narrative of stadial history cherished by Scott, mixing up the chivalric manners of a more advanced age with the barbarism of primitive folk heroes like Fingal and his Fianna, or the transmission of those stories through a genuinely popular culture. In this respect, it's appropriate that Scott should put these authentic Ossianic verses into the mouth of Hector MacIntyre, who, for all his faults and stereotypical Gaelic impetuosity, is intended as a more acceptable embodiment of the modern Gael than anything invented by Macpherson. This is a contemporary image of an officer at the Black Watch, 1789, so just 5 years before the setting of the novel. So that's, I guess, what Hector might have looked like. Splendid uniform. As a captain of the Black Watch, Hector represents the ancient martial spirit of Fergus MacIver in Waverley, redeemed from the rebellious taint of Jacobitism and pressed into the service of the British state. We might also recall that E.D. Ochiltree, although he's not a Highlander, has also served in the Fort Etoile in the Black Watch and has served at a number of battles, including Fontenoy. As William Donaldson notes, the gallantry of Highland soldiers at Quebec, Ticonderoga and Seringapatam, not to mention Alexandria, which we've already discussed, and more recently Waterloo, and this is the Black Watch at Quatre Bras, just the year before the novel was published in 1815, enabled even the staunchest Whig to accept the Highlanders as the latter-day standard-bearers of the ancient military ideals of the Scots, as they played a key role in the continuous redefinition of national stereotypes in the century following the Union. Scott may have known that the martial virtues of Fingal and his Fianna had also been employed in the 1790s by the great Gaelic poet Duncan Ban MacIntyre, another loyalist MacIntyre, same clan as Hector, to promote anti-Jacobin and anti-French propaganda. He'd written a number of Gaelic poems in which the Breadalbin fencibles are likened to the Fianna, and their leader, the Earl of Breadalbin, is seen as a Fingal kind of hero. Very different interpretation, ideological development of the Ossian stories from that was undergoing in Ireland at the same time, as Luke Gibbons has shown. You know, we need to remember what Fenian means by the 1840s. It becomes very much a rebellious figure of Irish nationalism. Attacking the Fenians are those who are subverting the British state. The Scottish version, the Duncan Ban MacIntyre version, is a loyalist version of the Fenian, the Fianna. In conclusion, I want to return to an earlier passage of the novel where Oldbuck attempts to persuade Lovell, whom he suspects to have poetic talents, to compose an epic poem for which he will write the antiquarian notes. I'll supply you with the subject: the battle between the Caledonians and Romans, the Caledoniad, or invasion repelled. Let that be the title. It will suit the present taste, and you may throw in a touch of the times. But, responds Lovell, the invasion of Agricola was not repelled. No, but you're a poet, free of the corporation, and as little bound down to truth or probability as Virgil himself. You may defeat the Romans in spite of Tacitus. Taking a leaf out of Macpherson's book, Oldbuck's rewriting of history is justified by the present taste, and we're talking about, well, we've acknowledged there's an issue with the chronology, but around about 1794. Anyway, the fear is there's a French invasion, whether it's from the French Directory or from Napoleon, doesn't really matter. This demands a rewriting of history and the creation of a patriotic epic that will imagine the repulsion of foreign invaders. In so doing, Oldbuck boasts that I'll annihilate Ossian, Macpherson, and Macrib. Though the plot of the Caledonia might sound distinctly Fingalian and representing Caledonians defeating a foreign invasion, we should recall that Oldbuck was convinced that the Aboriginal Scots were Goths, not Celts. So his response to Macpherson was to rewrite Scottish patriotism in a Gothic idiom. As we've seen, the French invasion turns out to be a hoax, but Lovell's restoration as a legitimate Lord Geraldine, converted from ancestral Catholicism to the Protestant faith, permits his acceptance by Isabella Wardour, representing a Waverley-like marriage union. The historical false alarm is an opportunity not only for resolving the fictional plot, but also provides an opportunity for a display of Highland martial pomp, as Lord Glenallan's tenants from the upland glens, the upland parts of his estate, they form a regiment, quote, of 500 men, completely equipped with a Highland dress, whom he had brought down from his upland glens with their pipes playing in the van. Forced to swallow his anti-Celtic animus, Oldbuck is pleased to note how the ancient military spirit of Glenallan's house seemed to animate and invigorate the decayed frame of the Earl, their leader. And as it turns out, this military apparition of feudal loyalty is to be Lovell or Neville or Lord Geraldine's inheritance. Even Hector McIntyre is impressed by this display of Celtic military panache, and is forced to totally revise his views of Lovell, or as we now know, Lord Geraldine. By 1816, it might have been relatively easy for Scott to write off the French invasion scares of the 1790s in a mock-heroic vein, but there's nothing mocking about the neo-feudal tartan pageantry evoked here, which totally eclipses old Buckian scepticism about bare-arsed kilts, and offers a preview of Scott's management of the King's Jaunt in 1822, when Edinburgh was literally wrapped in tartan. Moreover, the exposure of Duster Swivel, the conman mining speculator, as a German Illuminatus, does little to promote the Gothic cause, as Oldbuck is forced to concede. So it's Germans here who are looking kind of sinister, and a bunch of sinister fifth columnists. Scott's irenic vision of Britain resolves ethnic conflict between Goths and Celts in the interests of national unity, but it's the beginning of a kind of as I said, a kind of tartanization process, which gets stronger and stronger as the 19th century progresses. Oldbuck spoke of annihilating Macpherson by rewriting his epic Fingal as the Caledoniad. I'll close with a very tentative suggestion that Scott might have pursued a similar goal in borrowing a markedly Macphersonian plot for his novel, hackneyed as it has seemed to many critics. In the 1805 review of Malcolm Lang's edition of Ossian, Scott glossed the plot of Macpherson's earlier pre-Ossian poems, The Hunter and the Highlander. An unknown youth arrives at the Scottish camp when the Danes have made good a descent upon the coast. It will be readily anticipated that he becomes the principal hero in the ensuing battle, is discovered to be the lawful heir of the Scottish crown, marries the beautiful princess, and reigns in peace and glory. Do you recognise the plotline? Fiona Stafford's analysis of this rather stale romance plot offers a bit more nuance. Macpherson, she writes, examines the idea of the prince raised in obscurity, proving his worth through deeds rather than merely inheriting his power. In both, the military interests of Scotland being close to defeat, but emerging victoriously, is mingled with a romantic tale of love and marriage. Stafford also notes that the young, and I'm really in my last paragraph, you'll be pleased to hear, Stafford also notes that the young Macpherson drew on the narrative of the authentic Gaelic Magnus ballad, which told the story of the King of Lochlin's, that's the King of Norway's, invasion of Ireland, providing the plot line for Macpherson's English translation of Fingal. The tale of the, and I'll give you the slide, the tale of the unknown nobleman discovering, and this is the unknown nobleman here is Finn MacCool, the tale of the unknown nobleman discovering his true birth and atoning for the death of his father has much in common with the legend of Finn MacCool, whose father was traditionally slain by Gol MacMorna at the Battle of Crop, so that the orphan boy had to be brought up in obscurity. Eventually, the son discovers his true identity and reclaims his father's position as head of the militia, reconciling the two warring factions of Clan Basnia and Clan Morna. Seen in this light, several episodes of the Antiquary might be read as mock-heroic reworkings of Macpherson's plot, with Warder and Glenallan as the failed guardians of Yulin, Hector McIntyre as the flawed hero Cuchulainn, and Lovell as a mysterious Fingalian commander. The hero reappears at a crucial point of the narrative in the guise of the conquering hero to repel invasion, after fighting a duel with McIntyre for the hand of the heroine. It's of course precisely the function of the Caledoniad to ironize the relation between epic, whether it's neoclassic epic, of which obviously the Caledoniad is an example, or Ossianic, and the Antiquary's modern, novelistic, mock-heroic narrative, when nothing of world historical importance ends up happening. That's the big difference, isn't it, between the Caledoniad and the Antiquary, or indeed Fingal. So nothing ends up happening, but at least nothing of world historical importance ends up happening. But what the novel does is literally expose history in the making between facts and frauds. But if I'm correct, Scott's novel might have owed a bit more to Macpherson's fraudulent Ossian than he was willing to acknowledge. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that very wide-ranging, diverse and ingenious talk. Congratulations on disentangling all the sort of ideological and historical positions in this novel. It does make my head spin every time I come in contact with it again, but I think you did it marvellously well. It's amazing that this was such a popular novel in its time. Archibald Constable printed an unprecedented 10,000 copies and sold them within a couple of weeks. So the contemporary audience obviously took to this in some way or other, it seems. But I'll shut up now. I'm sure there are questions from the floor.
First of all, agree with Peter's summation of the wonderful way you unpick all that stuff that's going on, not only in the Antiquary, but also in a lot of Ossian material that isn't really very well known. So thank you for that. Because despite having written on the Antiquary, I can't remember it very well. So I'm going to slightly ask a different question. So thinking of the non-event of the Antiquary, the invasion of France, I wondered if you'd thought about or looked at the way in which the debate about Ossian in Scotland and in Britain as a whole absorbed the popularity of Ossian in France. So I'm thinking of that famous story of Napoleon conquering Europe with a copy of Burns of Ossian in his greatcoat pocket, or that wonderful Giraudet painting with Ossian receiving the souls of dead French soldiers into a kind of weird Celtic heaven.
Yes, thanks. That's a very interesting question. Of course, it's massively popular in both in French and Italian. Cesarotti's translation comes out in 1764, so it's translated into Italian almost immediately, and from there into French. It's translated into Alexandrines, of course, which slightly changes the feel. But as Pennant is alluding to, most people know that Napoleon apparently carried it was battle reading. He carried Fingal on his campaigns. And the night before a battle, he'd read a few passages, from Fingal to stir his spirit. I think that's part of the fascinating story of the reception of the poem in different European cultures, and indeed in different cultures within the Britain and Irish archipelago, because, as I've said, the Irish, there was a Republican Jacobinical interpretation in Ireland. It becomes a nationalist Fenianism in the 19th century, but in the Scottish Gaeltacht, it seems to be much more of a, certainly in the work of Duncan Ban McIntyre, it's much more of a loyalist version of Fingal and the Fianna. I wonder if people in Britain knew about how popular it was in France. That might have surprised quite a few people. I'm just thinking, I'm currently teaching the wonderful poet Helen Maria Williams, her Letters from France at the moment, and she was a half Scottish, half Welsh lady who was a resident in Paris from the mid-1790s and wrote a series of letters from France, kind of explaining, she was a kind of foreign correspondent explaining to the British readership what was going on in the French Revolution. And she fell foul of Robespierre, and that wasn't difficult, but she also fell foul of Napoleon. And there's a great passage where she says, in the 79, after the Directory, she admired Napoleon because he loved Ossian. But now, in 1805, she realised that he only read Ossian because he only read it for the battle scenes. and precisely. And of course, there are different ways you can read. You can read Ossian as a melancholy, poem of the last of the race, solitude, melancholy, in a very kind of quietistic way. Or you can focus on the figure of the aged blind bard, Ossian, or you can focus on the more upfront militaristic figure of Finn McCool and culture and the other warriors. I think Ossian's done a big job of trying to reduce that to distance the actual military heroism. But the fact that Napoleon read it the night before battles meant that he was quite aware of that. And so I think there's a very wide variety of ways in which it can be read as a poem, but also in different national cultures in the same period. Does that kind of go?
Nigel, I was first intrigued and then most impressed to hear you use the term unconformity. Are you deliberately appropriating that term from geology? Because it reminds me very much of the descriptions by James Hutton of unconformities at Sigger Point, etc. And are you basically saying that if you look at Macpherson you can look at them as textually a basic sedimentary deposit, about which there are intrusions of more recent
Absolutely, you spotted it, David. Absolutely.
Well done.
No, I can't. Unfortunately, I can't take credit for it because I borrowed the term from Eric Judal, who's a genius American critic who has written a book of that name called Ossianic Unconformities. But yes, what he's saying basically is that what he's trying to do is to read the Ossian phenomenon in relation to Huttonian earth science. And he's arguing that the tilting mechanism, the unconformities that Hutton is discovering are very similar to the ways in which both Macpherson and Hugh Blair in his dissertation on Ossian are having to explain the fact that there's a mix-up of different stages of history, so that these primitive pastoral people like Finn McCool and the Fianna are showing these they're showing chivalry and romance and love interest when real savages wouldn't have been interested in these things. And Lord Kames, the Scottish Enlightenment were very concerned about that. It was a difficult, and one of the reasons Hume rejects Ossian as authentic is because he can't see that as being, he can't accept that. He thinks that's just, the unconformity is just not going to work. Lord Kames, I think, if I remember rightly, makes there's a lot of special pleading that only in Scotland could it have been possible for primitive people to have these chivalric and romantic kind of manners. But it's very, very interesting, I think, the way that Eric looks at it in relation to Hutton, which is, of course, a theory that's emerging about the same time.
Yes.
And it begs lots of questions about the ways in which actual geological theory might have played into literary thinking and poetics in the period.
And emerged first in the Salisbury Prize.
And emerged, again, a local phenomenon.
I'm interested in what you say about the renaming of Clough Ossian. Could it not be the other way around? That Clough Ossian was renamed because among the travelling people, for example, they had no access to any literary sources. For example, there are recordings of Blind Alistair Stewart, who was a tinkerman, and he talked about Clough Ossian and Loch Ossian, and he also recited long tales of Ossian, and there are many recordings of people in tradition reciting Ossianic poems. I heard one 2 weeks ago in Para from a woman who did, that she recited the Lay of the Smith, Duna Hiabi. And there's so much of it in oral tradition. I feel there's no doubt that James Macpherson, growing up in Maiden, must have heard them, and then transmitting them to an English setting. But I have no doubt that they're rooted in what he heard in Maiden.
That's fascinating, really. I think it's spot on that there's no smoke without fire. All these, and in the case of Clough Ossian particularly, I think I wouldn't be at all surprised that that wasn't the local name for it before Wade's soldiers came along and discovered it and announced that it was. If you look at Edmund Burt's Letters from the North of Scotland, published in 1754, he tells the story of the discovery of it's basically a Bronze Age burial under the stone by a bunch of soldiers who were making the road through the small glen, and they decided it's a Roman burial. But of course, they would do because they're.
I think that people used to wind up Bert, if I might say so.
Oh yeah.
Because he also reports things which he completely misinterprets. And again, around Maiden, he talks about the traditions of the Rutherland barracks, which as where at the soldiers who would cover the groom the night before his wedding in time. He said it must be a military tradition, but of course it wasn't.
No.
It was a widely and very ancient tradition after that.
Burt's fascinating because he's one of the earliest commentators on the Highland traditions and certainly in English text writing or whatever. It's very interesting too that he's Scott's main authority. That Scott doesn't, as I said, he doesn't mention Macpherson or the Ossianic tradition in any of his notes to the poems set in the Highlands, like the Lady of the Lake and the Trossachs or the Lord of the Isles. But there's or Waverley. There's lots of Burt. So Burt becomes his main authority on Highland manners. I find that quite fascinating, quite interesting. But I think if you just need to look at the one great evidence of what you're saying is that if you look at the Roy military map of Scotland, which is completed before the Ossian poems are published in 1753, it's quite clear that Loch Ossian is represented on that map, and there are lots of other Dunfins and Finglens and places that have authentic Ossianic names. I'm personally convinced that Fingal's Cave is a genuine Ossianic name. It's Uan Ahin. Not the big debate was that it might have been Uan Athin, the melodious cave, but actually Banks got it right, I think. Banks had speaking to him. We know there were 2 Gaelic speakers on the island with him, and he got the right version of it. He takes it down phonetically in his unpublished journal. Pennant gets it wrong then, and that opens the way for a misinterpretation of the cave's name. But I'm sure that's right. There were Ossianic place names everywhere, and they were part of local. It's just that often they weren't written down. We don't know much about them. Thank you.
Any other questions? I think for the Scots in Edinburgh, it's a cleft stick for them because they had a world success on their hands. A great national origin on the one hand, and yet there are all these forensic lawyers and sceptical philosophers around. Very interesting controversy in that respect as well.
But they were the ones who encouraged it. They encouraged Macpherson to do it. They paid for him to do his field work. It was James Boswell and John Hume and many of the other literati who paid for him. They raised the money. It was like a research fellowship to go out to the Outer Isles, to go to the US and Skye, to gather Ossianic Finnegat material. So it's a very complicated story, isn't it?
Thank you very much. And before I close, just to mention our next talk, the last in this series, is being given by Tom Mole, the University of Edinburgh. And he'll be talking, his topic is Scott in Stone, the Scott Monument in the Victorian Pantheon. So if anybody hasn't got a ticket, we've still got tickets available, and they can be got through the website or Lee, who is there. You can sit and look out of the window from the New Club and look at the Scott Monument while hearing the exposition all at the same time. But anyway, we finally drawing to close, and Dr. Ian Gordon-Burns giving a vote of thanks.
How many votes of thanks does a man need? He's already.
You don't have to say it.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, had things been different, Professor Nigel Leask or somebody else in this room might have been thanking me for a lecture which I delivered. Perhaps because I'm a past president of the Edinburgh Walter Scott Club, or just possibly because I've worked and written on Scottish antiquarianism. I was invited to give a talk on this occasion on Scott and antiquarianism in commemoration of the bicentenary of the publication of the Antiquary. I declined for the very good reason that I would be giving a very similar talk at the joint Society of Antiquaries of Scotland and Abbotsford Trust Conference on Scott the Antiquary, due to take place tomorrow. In the event, this has been cancelled at very short notice. So perhaps I could, after all, have addressed you. But I could not have done so nearly as well as Nigel Leask has. You and I, all of us, have been infinitely more fortunate in having heard him than we would have been if I'd been the speaker. I should have been much less penetrating and authoritative, even if I too would have gone back to the text of the Antiquary in order to tease out aspects of Mr. Oldbuck's character and mental outlook, and thus to set him in the context of what the eccentric Earl of Buchan called the rusty and the musty branches of Scottish antiquarianism of the 18th and earlier 19th centuries. Nigel Leask has, I think, concentrated on the musty aspects of Oldbuck's antiquarianism, his interest in literature, language, and the oral tradition. I'd have been more rusty and would have concentrated on his interest in the material remains of the past. So, as literary scholars, you've really done much better with Professor Leask, and he's given us an excellent lecture. And there's the additional pleasure for those of us who've seen the recent wonderful exhibition on the Celts round the corner at the museum. And Penny Fielding has really alluded to what I was just going to wrap up with. Because in that exhibition was shown Napoleon's own special copy of Ossian, once in his library at Fontainebleau, and that book normally lives next door in the National Library. Napoleon, of course, carried another less good copy with him on campaign. And you'd also have seen an image of that contemporary and highly romantic vision of Ossian receiving the souls of French generals killed in Napoleon's campaigns, the composition heavy with ancient Roman symbolism. And that, I think, says much about the impact of Ossian on the European mind of the day. And who did Scott devote so much literary time to in the mid-1820s? Napoleon Bonaparte, the man with whom he shared a birthday. Scott, Ossian, antiquarianism, and the world of Napoleon's empire all rolled up together. Thank you, Nigel, for a most stimulating commemorative lecture.